Good day to all of you. It's Ido Aharoni again, having the great pleasure of hosting here my dear friend, Professor Nick Cull of the University of Southern California, where he's heading one of the most unique programs. I've been there, the program for public diplomacy. He is one of the world's greatest experts on this issue, and he is a frequent speaker at our NYU's conference. And hopefully, you'll also become part of the work of the Leon Charney Forum on New Diplomacy. It's good to have you here, Nick.
Thanks, Ido. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
My first question, please tell us about the center at the Annenberg School. Tell us about your academic work.
Well, the idea of the program is to provide a professional training for people who are going to work doing the communication aspects of diplomacy, the public aspects of diplomacy. We set the program up about 14 years ago now. We thought it was going to be for government people, but in fact, the students who come forward are more likely to be non-government, and they want to be free to promote an international conversation, and they tend to see international relations as being between individuals and communities rather than just between nation states.
Which is essentially the definition of new diplomacy.
Absolutely. I would have come to your conference anyway, but I was particularly keen to be part of this conversation because I think now so often we see that nation states are in a stalemate, so somebody has to come to the field with something new. And maybe people-to-people diplomacy, maybe city-to-city. Maybe this is a place, an area where we can move things along and build new kinds of partnerships.
So there are two different, when people say diplomacy, in my experience, they refer to two different things. Yeah. There is diplomacy in the context of high policy,
yes,
and there is diplomacy, the practice. The occupation,
right.
If you made the profession. I wish people would recognize it as a profession. Right now it's being recognized as an occupation. But what do you see as the key to the training of better diplomats in the future?
Well, first thing to say is that when people hear I'm interested in diplomacy, they expect me to be polite. So there's like a popular meaning of diplomacy, which isn't necessarily, should we say, it raises people's expectations. The lesson number one for me is if you're going to communicate, listen first. And you would have thought that everybody who had a mother knew that. But it turns out, whether your mother told you or not, you get to a stage in life, you get to a level in your government, and people forget to listen. They remember to speak, but they forget to listen, they forget to think what's the context in which this communication is taking part. So for me, the starting point of diplomacy, however you define it, has to be a listening process, and that we move forward from that.
And what about the incorporation of new skill set, digital literacy?
This is a good question, and the big growth area in public diplomacy studies is around research into new media and Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all these people are studying how countries develop their digital profile, how countries reach out. But to be honest, we're still waiting for the scholar to come forward and prove that a digital campaign won an international situation or prevailed in an international situation. There are lots of examples of it helping, but it's yet to, we haven't really found an open and shut case of truly successful digital diplomacy. And in fact, what worries me about the digital is that people think, oh, if I understand the digital, I don't have to bother with all the old stuff. And to me, what still matters most is understanding the situation, listening before you speak, seeing the process as being about a relationship. And the worst thing with digital is when people, and I can think of some governments, that they say, well, we want to use digital to win. And one of the lessons of diplomacy is you don't win relationships. If you try to win your relationships, you're psychotic. What you need to do is to develop a perception of mutual benefit and work to create avenues for that kind of a perception of a shared interest. And once you've got that, a lot can be done, and sure, digital can be part of an overall diplomatic profile. But I am concerned a little bit about an overemphasis. So the book I've got coming out is called Public Diplomacy: Foundations for Public Engagement in a Digital Age. So I'm talking about the foundations, and there's a lot in there about how to do digital diplomacy, but I feel you have to have the foundation right. You can't just stick the house up without paying attention to the foundations. And some of the approach to digital overemphasizes the method rather than the you know how we have to pay attention to the basics.
As a former government employee, I was always frustrated how little awareness governments have, and it doesn't have to be a national government, it could also be a city government,
Yeah.
To the need to conduct their own independent research. What do you think can be done to change that mindset? Because politicians, by definition, they want to see results immediately.
Well, but the problem is that that if the results they will see if they leap without looking are not going to be good results.
Hence Brexit.
Hence, yeah, well, that's right. That's hitting a man while he's down. But yeah, no. But this is a big screw up. But to be honest, there are multiple failures of public diplomacy in Brexit, and one of the problems in that situation is that for many years the European Union did not explain itself to Britain. So you have the European Union not explaining itself to Britain, and you have different British leaders not explaining the European Union to their own publics. I can understand why Margaret Thatcher, back in the day, would not say X and Y good things have happened, and that has to do with the European Union. But why Tony Blair didn't credit the European Union for successes and positive changes in the UK, that's kind of unforgivable, because his public diplomacy strategy in the about 2008, it had Britain partnering with the European Union was one of the major things that the UK talked about. But it didn't talk about it, and how are British people going to be aware of the benefits of the European Union? So I see it as a massive failure of public diplomacy, and I hope that other countries, in order to avoid the mess, that they'll look at us and say, well, how do we not end up like the UK? And keeping the people with a major diplomatic commitment like the European Union, that had to be an ongoing process. Look, let me tell you something they could have done, because it's easy for me to just sit here. If you look at how citizenship in a nation is built, partly it's through classes in school, and things like the badges that you earn in the Boy Scouts. There's no Boy Scout badge for knowing the European Union, but that's the sort of thing you need in the British Boy Scouts, is a little European Union badge, and then people would feel part of it, aware of it, they'd have got something back from it. But if you haven't got these little micro-level connections, I think it got a little better when they started having license plates with the European flag on, to show people, well, it's your nation, your national letters, GB for Great Britain, but in a European context. It started to make those tiny little connections.
Right, and I think maybe it also, I don't know, I'm just guessing, maybe one of the reasons it happened is because it was in total contradiction to the Cull Britannia campaign of a few years earlier, right. Which really highlighted UK rather than Great Britain.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It was all about UK and was all about London.
Yeah.
And it's all about being cool and being unique.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about being part of Europe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the things I'll say tomorrow is that the true price of a nation branding campaign, if you pick the wrong elements of emphasis, the true price of the campaign may be the opportunity cost in partnering with others, rather than the money you pay to the branding expert for helping you develop the slogan and the logo and all that stuff. The real cost is in the way, how it can get in the way of partnership. And I think that Blair realized Cull Britannia, or the elements of that in his policy, were getting in the way, and so he walked away from that to a policy based on cooperation. And then we then moved from that to the Great Campaign. But the real problem in the UK is the underlying sense of the country, that British people have a sense of the country as being different from other European countries, that we still tell stories about how we saved the world in World War II, that we haven't had to think about the dark places in our national history. It's not that we don't have them, it's that we didn't have to talk about them in the way that the French or the Italians or the Germans had to live with problematic aspects of their history. And so I think that Brexit, in a way, reflects an approach to British national identity which overemphasizes our specialness. And it's like we feel so special that we can't be part of a community. So in a way, we're to be pitied for not being able to cope with being part of what's actually a pretty terrific project if thought through appropriately.
Let me ask you one final question. We're talking a lot about public diplomacy. You're probably one of the best people in the world to have the perspective about who's doing it right.
Right.
Who's doing it right or close to doing it right?
Well, I think it depends on which part of public diplomacy you're talking about. There are the institutional foundations in Britain, I think, are pretty good. That an organization like the British Council, or in Germany the Goethe Institute, they're great at doing the cultural diplomacy. And if you look at international broadcasting, I remain impressed by what the BBC is doing, by what Deutsche Welle is doing, by what France 24 is doing. So I think that the mechanisms of European public diplomacy are strong and are worth studying. To me, the tragedy is US public diplomacy, because they have some of the best trained people in the world, but right now, I don't think they're getting the best instruction. And I think the problem is at the top. And I would hope that at some point the United States can be back in the position that it had in the Cold War, that it had during World War II, even back during World War I, where it was articulating a vision of the future that was so attractive. Not only the Allied countries could say, yeah, that's something we'd like to be part of, but the adversary countries could kind of catch the dream as well. And I don't see anybody doing that effectively right now, and certainly I don't see the United States doing it. So I'm more aware of the defects, but I think the fundamentals in the systems of public diplomacy of the Europeans, I would stand by those being admirable and a good model for others who are looking at, well, how do we get public diplomacy developed for our international actor.
Well, thank you so much for this insightful interview. It's always a pleasure.
A pleasure to be here and to be able to catch up with you, Ido.
And I'm sure that our students will benefit a great deal from this. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.